Hello, my name is Zola Elliott, and I'm doing a short podcast on the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. We'll be discussing a bit about the author, a brief overview of the story, some of my impressions, and how it fits into the genre of Victorian literature. To start, a little bit about Oscar Wilde. He was born on October 16, 1854, to William and Jane Wilde. He was an Irish poet and dramatist, most famous for The Picture of Dorian Gray, his only novel, and the play The Importance of Being Earnest. He had two siblings, an older brother named William and a younger sister named Isola, who died of fever at 10 years old. He attended Trinity College in Dublin between 1871 and 1874, and the Magdalen College in Oxford from 1874 to 1878. While he was at Oxford, he was known as an advocate for the aesthetic movement in the early 1880s, which aimed to produce art for art's sake. He also won the Newdigate Prize in 1878 for his long poem, Ravenna. He released his first collection of poetry titled Poems in 1881. In 1884, he married Constance Lloyd, and they had two sons in 1885 and 1886. During this time, he was also a reviewer in 1881 and the editor of The Woman's World from 1887 to 1889. In 1888, he published The Happy Prince and Other Tales, which are fairy tales that he wrote for his sons. The Picture of Dorian Gray was published in 1891, and it originally had a negative response due to its homoerotic overtones. That same year, Oscar Wilde started to have an affair with Lord Alfred Douglas. In April of 1895, Oscar Wilde sued Lord Douglas's father for libel for accusing him of homosexuality. This case was unsuccessful, and Wilde was arrested and tried for gross indecency. He was then sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for sodomy. A few years prior, his marriage had ended in 1893. While in jail, he wrote De Profundis, which was addressed to Lord Alfred Douglas. He was released in 1897, where he then wandered Europe before dying penniless of cerebral meningitis on November 30th, 1900. A little bit about The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was published in 1890 in Lippincott's magazine, and then released in 1891 as a revised and expanded book with 6 additional chapters. A brief overview of the story is that it's about the young and beautiful Dorian Gray, who, under the guidance of Lord Henry Wotton and his views on sensuality in art, decides that he wishes to remain as beautiful and young as the portrait that a mutual friend, Basil Hallward, painted of him. Over the time, the portrait starts to reflect the sins and moral failings of Dorian, who remains unchanged in appearance. Some of my impressions of the story. The opening was very obviously homoerotic, like the critics originally mentioned. And I even noticed this before I found out that Oscar Wilde went through the trial for being a gay man. I could already tell that Basil Hallward, Lord Henry Wotton, and Dorian Gray were all somewhat queer, especially Basil and Dorian. I also noticed that it was very interesting how after the death of Sybil and Dorian reads like the yellow book that he gets from Lord Henry, Dorian kind of just goes immediately crazy. He just starts, there's almost a click in his head, and he just starts being incredibly selfish and just self-centered, doesn't really care about what anyone thinks. He just wants to be beautiful all the time. When I was first reading the novel, the first half was interesting but kind of slow at points, and then around chapter 12 things just started getting very interesting and very crazy. It felt like there was just one thing after another, and Basil gets murdered, Sybil's brother James threatens Dorian, and then in the very end, Dorian just kills himself. As just a general character, I also noticed that Dorian was very impulsive, very stubborn, and kind of manic. He, like I mentioned earlier, he just kind of goes off the deep end immediately. And when he meets Sybil, he immediately is like, oh, I love her, and just immediately devotes himself to her. He mentions Sybil to Lord Henry, and then that night Lord Henry comes back from something and there's a telegram saying, oh yeah, I proposed to her, we're engaged now. And she just calls him Prince Charming, so they obviously do not know each other very well, but he decides to propose anyway, and that just shows he's just kind of impulsive, doesn't really think things through. And when he notices the changes in the picture that first night, he starts thinking about it, and then he covers it and decides to deal with it the next day. And then the next day he's like, we're just gonna chill with the fact that the painting now carries all of my flaws. And he kind of impulsively kills Basil too. He's just, I don't know how else to describe it. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how the main character in Death Note just gets the journal that kills people and then just immediately starts killing people. Mind you, this kid's supposed to be just your average high schooler. So he just kind of goes crazy right off the bat. Lastly, I wanted to talk about kind of how it relates to the Victorian literature genre and just the class topic of the survey of English literature. So the Portrait of Dorian Gray is considered to be a late Victorian era Gothic novel. The Gothic elements I mainly noticed through the portrait because it grows more and more disfigured with every sin that Dorian commits before he eventually stabs the canvas, which kills himself and restores the canvas in the process. And the elements of the Victorian genre. So the Victorian era takes place during the rule of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. The Victorian era literature introduces the concept of a serial novel because they created new printing practices, so novels were easier to produce, and at that point they were also producing them and publishing them through things like magazines and newspapers, where they were doing little bits at a time. And there were also the concepts of lending libraries, which they wanted longer books so that they could lend out more books to the readers, so they would break up the novel into multiple sections. And Dorian Gray, like I mentioned earlier, was originally published in the serialized form through the Lippincott magazine. The Victorian era literature also involves a lot of different types of realism. The Picture of Dorian Gray, especially in the very early chapters, shows this realism just by talking about the characters' daily lives. Like, you see him going to the theater, and you see him going to these dinner parties, and you see Lord Henry and Basil doing all of that stuff too. It's just their daily lives. Another example that we talked about for Victorian literature was the Goblin Market, and that fits into a more narrative poetry style of the day because the Goblin Market tells the story to the audience. Just to wrap things up, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. It is a great look at just how kind of messed up the world can be sometimes and how people's worldviews can affect others, because Lord Henry was the one who kind of introduced Dorian to all of this selfishness, sense of beauty, all of that, at the very, very introduction of the book when the two of them first meet. So it just shows how quickly people's minds can be changed about things, and you see that nowadays as well. But I think this is a great example of Victorian and Gothic literature, especially because it has these kind of supernatural elements, but it also talks about the daily life, which was very common in Victorian literature. That is all for today. Thank you for joining me.